Usually when we look at a massive towering skyscraper, your brain immediately categorizes it as, well, invincible.
Right, it's just this permanent fixture.
Exactly. You stand on the sidewalk, you crane your neck up at the steel and the glass,
Yeah.
and there is this implicit expectation of absolute permanence.
Because it's an engineering marvel, right?
Yeah, it is standing, therefore it is solid. It's a binary categorization in our minds. It's either standing or not standing.
It's a very clean, comforting thought, honestly. It feels completely binary. We like our structures, whether they are, physical buildings, massive corporations, or even entire geopolitical systems. We want them to be visible and, above all, safe.
So safe.
Right, like if it's there today, we just assume it's going to be there tomorrow.
But you're ignoring the microscopic stress fractures building up deep inside the foundation. You ignore the invisible rust.
Yeah, the stuff you can't see.
Right, you don't see the tiny, imperceptible shifts in the bedrock underneath.
Which is, that's the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. To the untrained eye, the building is perfect.
Right.
But to the structural engineer, it's a disaster waiting for a timestamp.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We have a stack of translated lectures today that take this exact structural engineering mindset and, well, they apply it to human history.
It's incredible.
It really is. Specifically, we are looking at lecture 7 out of 13 from the Totally Islam digital audio series, and we are zeroing in on a fascinating ancient text, Surah Al-Anbiya, verses 39 through 50.
Right.
And I promise you right now, this is not going to be a standard theological read.
No, definitely not.
We are completely discarding the traditional religious sentimentality. We are throwing out the clerical tropes today.
It is an absolute paradigm shift.
Because if you open a standard run-of-the-mill commentary on this specific text, you get a very simplistic, almost cartoonish narrative.
Yeah, your standard fire and brimstone description.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It talks about, bad people being trapped in literal hellfire, followed by a story of Moses going up a mountain to get a magic holy book.
Right.
And God hanging these giant, literal metallic scales in the sky on Judgment Day to weigh people's good and bad deeds.
It's all framed as purely mystical.
Completely mystical.
What's fascinating here is that this traditional interpretation is essentially an outdated mythological placeholder.
Wait, a mythological placeholder? What do you mean by that?
Well, think about how we explain cloud computing to a 5-year-old. We say, your pictures live up in the cloud.
Right, it's a simplification.
Exactly, it's a placeholder. We don't explain server farms, thermal cooling, fiber optic cables, and data redundancy protocols to a kid. We just say, the cloud. The ancient commentators did the same thing with these verses. When the text uses intense physical metaphors like sudden destruction, blindness, and scales of justice, it isn't threatening people with magic.
It's not magic.
No, it is a high-level systems audit.
A systems audit.
Yes. It is describing the absolute point of impact when a society's hidden systemic debt, its structural inequity, finally catches up to it, and how the universe utilizes this zero-error mathematical metric to regulate human history.
Okay, to really ground this, because I want you, the listener, to see how practical this is, let's look at the specific historical ground zero the source material brings up.
The Quraysh.
Yes, the Quraysh, which was the ruling elite of ancient Mecca. No, the traditional story I was always taught was that the Quraysh fought the prophet because of religion.
Right, the classic good versus evil theology.
Exactly. They had their idols, he brought monotheism, so it was a holy war.
But the source material completely upends this.
Totally breaks it. The source points out a glaring historical fact. The Quraysh were incredibly tolerant of other religions.
They absolutely were.
They let Jews, Christians, and Magians live peacefully all over the Arabian Peninsula. They didn't have religious inquisitions.
Exactly. They were pluralistic because, well, pluralism was exceptional for business. You have to picture Mecca not as a dusty religious outpost, but as a massive, hyper-lucrative trade hub.
A financial center.
Yeah, it was positioned perfectly between the Byzantine Empire to the north and the rich trading courts of Yemen to the south.
Okay.
The Kaaba, their central sanctuary, was essentially an ancient Wall Street. It was a designated safe haven zone where all the warring tribes could come, trade their goods, and leave their weapons at the door.
So it was bad for business to fight over religion.
If you started a religious war, you would ruin the quarterly profits.
So if they were so tolerant, why the sudden, vicious, multi-year war against this specific new message?
Because, as the source argues, This new message wasn't just a new religion. It wasn't what they called a madhab.
A madhab.
Right, a private set of rituals where you go home, pray in a corner, and don't bother anyone. It was a deen.
Okay, let's unpack this. What is the difference between a madhab and a deen in this context?
So a madhab is a private belief system. A deen, on the other hand, is a comprehensive socio-economic system.
Oh, wow.
It is a complete structural overhaul of society. The Quraysh elites didn't care if you prayed to one god or 300 gods or a tree as long as you paid your taxes.
Right.
As long as you respected their trade monopolies and didn't unionize the laborers.
Wait, so you're saying this wasn't a holy war at all? It was essentially a corporate crackdown?
That is precisely what it was.
That's crazy.
It was a corporate crackdown by an entrenched, ultra-wealthy elite against a movement that was threatening to dismantle their entire supply chain and labor model.
Because the deen threatened the bottom line.
Exactly. The new system, this deen, was demanding an end to systemic exploitation. It was looking at the laborers, the marginalized, the people generating all the wealth for the mega trade routes, and demanding a redistribution of that wealth.
And the elites were not going to let that happen.
Of course not.
Yeah.
The elite class realized that if this new socioeconomic system gained a foothold, their days of sitting on velvet cushions, extracting unearned wealth while the masses starved, were completely over.
That is just wow. It completely changes the way you read history.
It really does.
The text we are analyzing today isn't a magical threat. It's the audit report being handed to that corporate elite, telling them exactly why their business model is mathematically doomed to fail.
Yes. And to understand exactly why their parasitic system was doomed, we have to look at the baseline reality that the text establishes.
Right.
The source goes into this incredibly deep analysis of the concept of Rahman.
Okay, and traditionally we translate Rahman as most gracious or most merciful.
Yeah.
And honestly, when I hear that, I just think of a cuddly, emotional, grandfatherly love in the sky. It sounds very warm, but not very scientific.
Which is another massive placeholder.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's an emotional anthropomorphism. It completely misses the mechanical, physical reality of the term. The source defines Rahman not as an emotion, but as an objective law of free life-sustaining provision.
Okay.
It's the baseline thermodynamics of the universe.
The baseline thermodynamics, meaning what exactly?
Meaning the universe is a free lunch system for biological life.
A free lunch system.
Yeah. It provides the core infrastructure for survival without asking for payment. The source uses the Arabic phrase zamat bila masa.
Zamat bila masa.
Exactly, which means provision completely free of cost and effort.
Okay, push back on that for a second, because if I am listening to this, I am thinking, you know, the universe doesn't hand me a paycheck.
Right.
If I don't work my 9-to-5 job, I can't pay my rent, and I will literally starve.
Sure.
So how can the source claim this is a free baseline? Isn't that just utopian idealism? We live in a world of scarcity.
That's exactly the friction we need to explore. You have to separate the natural baseline of the universe from the artificial friction imposed by human systems.
Okay, separate the two.
Think about the oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange. This is one of the brilliant practical analogies the source brings up.
Walk us through that.
Every single time you exhale, you are breathing out carbon dioxide, which is a lethal toxin to your biology.
All right.
If you were trapped in a perfectly sealed room, your own breath would eventually kill you.
It's a terrifying thought.
It is, but the universe has this automated, perfectly calibrated machinery running in the background. Trees, plants, oceanic phytoplankton that instantly takes that toxic exhaust, uses it for its own life processes, and pumps out fresh, life-sustaining oxygen for you.
And you don't get a bill for that at the end of the month.
Exactly. You don't have to work a 9-to-5 job to earn your next breath.
That's true.
The raw materials of survival, sunlight, rain, atmospheric pressure, the soil's ability to grow a seed, all of that is provided absolutely free. That automated, unearned provision is the physical manifestation of Rahman.
The source also uses this amazing analogy called the milk board.
Oh, yes.
I thought this was the perfect way to highlight just how robust this free system is.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the milk board analogy perfectly demonstrates the limits of human engineering versus the cosmic baseline.
Right.
The source asks us to imagine a human baby being born. Before that baby even takes its first breath, an automated system inside the mother's body has already been preparing a perfectly formulated nutritional supply.
It's dynamically adjusting the temperature, the exact mix of antibodies, the fats, the proteins required for that specific child.
At that exact stage of development, It is a flawless, biologically automated supply chain.
Yeah.
Now imagine if human beings had to invent a bureaucratic global milk board to handle this.
Oh, man.
Imagine a massive government agency or a multinational private corporation trying to synthesize, heat, and perfectly deliver that exact formula to every single infant on Earth.
At the exact moment of hunger.
Yes, without a single supply chain disruption.
It would be mathematically impossible.
Completely.
The logistics alone would cost trillions of dollars. There would be shipping delays, corporate monopolies, price gouging on baby formula.
Which actually happens in our modern system.
Yeah, that actually happened.
Precisely. Human systems create scarcity and friction, but the universe's baseline system does it automatically, flawlessly, and for free. That is Raman.
Okay, I see.
The universe operates on a baseline welfare system of free, life-giving inputs. So this raises an important question. If the baseline is free provision, where does poverty, collapse, and systemic friction come from?
From us. From the human elites.
Yes.
This is where the systemic rebellion starts. The source paints this vivid picture of what human history actually is. It's a story of a small group of people trying to build toll booths on the free highways of the universe.
That is the perfect way to phrase it.
The universe says, here is land, water, and sustenance for all. The human elite, whether it's the ancient Quraysh or modern billionaires, say, actually, we're going to put a massive fence around this land.
We own the water rights.
Right. Claim we own the water rights and charge everyone else rent just to exist on it.
The feudal landlords. The text critiques this heavily. It talks about the elites sitting on elevated beds while the laborers sit on the dirt floor.
Yeah.
The elites extract unearned wealth from the system. They aren't adding value to the thermodynamics of the planet. They are just siphoning energy from the baseline provision of the universe.
They are acting as systemic parasites.
And here is the core thesis of the systems audit we are looking at. The universe is fundamentally an engine of equilibrium.
Right.
When an elite class operates a parasitic system inside a universe that is physically designed for mutual sustenance, it violates the core laws of that universe.
Because it's a closed loop.
You cannot run a closed-loop system where all the energy, wealth, and resources are sucked to the very top without eventually starving the base structure.
It builds up invisible systemic friction.
Yeah.
Just like the microscopic stress fractures in the skyscraper foundation we talked about at the beginning.
Exactly. And that friction sets the stage for the inevitable crash.
Which brings us to the actual confrontation in the text. The corporate elites in Mecca are hearing this exact audit from the new socioeconomic movement.
Right.
They are essentially being told, your system is parasitic. You are violating the physics of Raman, and your monopoly is going to collapse.
And their response is incredibly arrogant.
Yes. In verse 38, the elites ask this mocking question. They do what every entrenched monopoly does when faced with a systemic critique.
They mock it.
Right. They ask, Mada hada al-wadu.
Yeah.
When will this promise come to pass?
Yeah.
They are saying, oh, our system is going to collapse. Our glorious trade empire is doomed. Give us a date. Give us a time on the calendar.
If you're so smart, when exactly is this supposed crash going to happen?
Exactly.
It's the arrogance of the day trader who thinks the bull market will last forever just because the stock hasn't crashed by Tuesday afternoon.
Right.
They demand a specific timestamp for a structural failure, completely misunderstanding how structural failures actually work in reality.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the text's answer to their arrogant question is deeply mechanical, and it uses a very specific Arabic word in verse 40, batatan. The text says the consequence, the collapse, will hit them batatan. Now, if you read a traditional surface-level translation, it just says suddenly.
Yeah, like out of nowhere.
It makes it sound like a magic lightning bolt is going to fall out of the sky on a random Tuesday. But what does batatan actually mean mechanically in the context of systems theory?
Batatan does not mean suddenly in a magical sense. It refers to a critical threshold breach.
A threshold breach.
It is the exact moment an economic bubble pops or a structural dam finally breaks.
So it's not random.
Not at all. Think about a massive concrete dam holding back a reservoir. To the uneducated, arrogant mayor standing at the bottom of the dam looking up at the dry concrete, everything looks fine.
Looks solid to me.
Right. So when the dam breaks, to him, the water hitting his city feels sudden. But to the structural engineer who has been monitoring the hydrostatic pressure, measuring the microfissures spreading across the concrete for a decade, it isn't sudden at all.
It's just the math.
It is the mathematically inevitable result of long-term compounding stress.
If you're listening to this and thinking about the 2008 financial crash, you are exactly on the right track.
The perfect example.
Think about how many people, how many brilliant Wall Street executives thought the housing market was a permanent law of physics.
They literally thought it could never fail.
Right. For the average person, or even the arrogant bankers riding the wave, the collapse happened suddenly. Baton.
Yeah.
One day Lehman Brothers was an absolute titan of global finance, and the next day it was gone.
But the systemic rot, the toxic mortgages, the parasitic extraction of wealth at the bottom, that had been compounding for years.
Precisely. The collapse is slow, 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 and then all at once.
And then all at once.
That all at once is baton. The elites in the text demand a specific date because their model of reality is entirely linear.
But collapse isn't linear.
Right. Systemic collapse is exponential. Once the threshold of vulnerability is breached, the negative feedback loops accelerate out of control.
And what happens to the elites when that bubble pops? The text uses another brilliant word right after that. Tabatuum.
Tabatuum.
It says the collapse hits them baton and leaves them tabatuhum. What does that mean? Total cognitive paralysis. They are left utterly dumbfounded.
Why, though? If they have all the money, all the private armies, all the political connections, why couldn't they just pivot? Why does it paralyze them?
Because this is a deeply ingrained psychological phenomenon. When an elite class has spent generations living inside an artificial bubble of their own supremacy, their brains literally lose the neuroplasticity required to process a systemic failure.
Wow.
They are so blinded by their own unproven assertions of security that when the real-world feedback loops finally hit, their minds just lock up.
Cognitive dissonance.
Profound cognitive dissonance.
They literally cannot process that their unassailable fortress is made of sand. They stare at the ticker tape as the stock goes to zero, completely unable to act.
Exactly. And because they are paralyzed, the verse concludes with a brutal statement, Fala yastatiuna radaha. They cannot repel it. All their wealth, all their private armies, all their political lobbying is useless against a physical law of collapse.
Right, you can't buy your way out of physics.
You cannot bribe gravity. You cannot lobby a tsunami. When the systemic debt comes due, the artificial power structures freeze, and they are swept away.
That is terrifyingly applicable to today.
Yeah, it really is.
The cognitive paralysis of leadership when faced with a true black swan event. But I want to dig deeper into why they are so blind. We touched on it, but the source explores this psychological vulnerability brilliantly in verse 44.
The engine of reason versus the tyranny of unproven assertions.
Yes.
The source highlights a very specific, revealing phrase in verse 44. Hatatala alehimul umur.
Hatatala alehimul umur.
This translates to the idea that generations of these elite families grew comfortable simply because they enjoyed material prosperity for an extended period of time.
They had a long runway, so they assumed the plane would never crash.
That is their massive psychological blind spot. The elite developed a deadly, unproven assertion.
Which was?
They equated long-term survival with absolute immunity from natural law.
Oh, I see.
They assumed that because their grandfathers exploited the system and got rich, and their fathers exploited the system and stayed rich, the system itself was a permanent fixture of the universe.
They mistook a temporary delay in consequences for an exemption from the rules.
Precisely. They built an entire ideology around their success. They told themselves, we are wealthy because we are divinely favored.
Right.
Our system works because it has always worked for us. They mistook the inertia of their privilege for the stability of their foundation.
And this is where the text just completely eviscerates their comfort zone with one of the most stunning metaphors I have ever seen in an ancient document.
The border erosion?
Yes, the physics of border erosion. The Arabic phrase is nankusaha min atrafiha. The text literally asks them, do they not see that we are reducing the earth from its borders?
Now, this is a phrase where traditionalists have historically twisted themselves into knots trying to explain it.
Really? How so?
Well, some ancient commentators thought it meant the literal physical flat earth was getting smaller at the edges.
Oh, like chunks falling off into space.
Right. Later on, when science proved the earth was a globe, theologians struggled to make the verse fit, suggesting maybe it meant coastal erosion or something like that.
But the source material Slices right through all that superstitious confusion.
Yeah, completely.
Right, because the source says we have to look at the linguistic context of the Arabs at the time. Reducing the earth from its borders is not a geographical statement.
No.
It is a geopolitical and economic idiom.
It's market share. It's territorial influence. It is the structural runway of an empire.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, imagine a massive legacy tech monopoly today.
Okay.
Let's call them, I don't know, Omnicorp.
Okay, Omnicorp.
Omnicorp has the biggest campus in Silicon Valley, the highest stock price, and a corporate culture of absolute arrogance. They have been on top for 30 years.
Right. They are untouchable.
They're resting on their laurels, throwing massive parties, celebrating their history, paying their executives absurd bonuses.
Their hatatala alihimul umur, their prolonged period of prosperity has made them blind.
Exactly. But meanwhile, a tiny, agile startup in a garage somewhere is slowly, methodically eating their market share from the edges.
They are losing a demographic here. It's a specific use case there.
They are bleeding talent to smaller firms. Their actual structural runway is shrinking daily.
Yeah.
But because their core revenue from their legacy product still looks okay on the quarterly report, the CEO doesn't notice. Reality is constantly shrinking their borders while they sit around celebrating their history.
That is the perfect analogy. Nankusua min atrafiha is the process of systemic erosion.
It's slow at first.
Yes. The collapse is happening incrementally before it happens baton suddenly.
The periphery falls first.
Always. The borders shrink. The outer colonies rebel. The lower-class laborers stop buying into the corporate narrative.
The supply lines get slightly more expensive.
Right. The ecosystem around the elite begins to constrict. The text is asking the elites of Mecca, are you so blinded by your historical wealth that you don't see your actual sphere of influence is mathematically contracting?
Your borders are eroding.
Your borders are eroding.
And because they are paralyzed by their unproven assertions, they don't see the borders shrinking until the enemy's inside the gates.
Exactly.
They are entirely oblivious to the social physics at play, which leads us to the ultimate mechanism of that collapse.
Right.
How exactly does the universe balance these books? Is it just bad luck, or are they just being punished by an angry deity? This takes us to verse 47 and the famous imagery of the scales of justice.
Wanata il mawazina lista.
Yes, we place the scales of justice.
And this is where we have to completely abandon the medieval paintings.
Oh yeah, those old frescoes.
If you grew up in a religious household, you probably have this image of a giant golden metallic scale hanging from a cloud, weighing magical fairy dust of good and bad deeds.
It's so literal.
That is absolutely not what this text is doing.
So the source explains this in terms of pure social physics. What does that mean? How does this algorithmic ledger actually work?
Whoa.
Because I'm struggling with the idea that the universe tracks everything. It sounds a little like magic again.
It's not magic, it's causality.
Causality.
The scales of justice is a metaphor for the law of Mukafat-e-amal.
Mukafat-e-amal.
This is an automated algorithmic system of absolute cause and effect. Think of it as the cosmic ledger.
Okay.
The universe tracks human actions, both individual and systemic, with perfect mathematical precision.
Just like physics.
Just as every physical action has an equal and opposite reaction in Newtonian physics, every single socioeconomic action has an inevitable systemic reaction in social physics.
You cannot cheat the math.
You cannot. And to illustrate how precise this math is, the text uses a very specific unit of measurement.
An input as tiny as a mustard seed.
Yes. Mithqala habatim min khardalin.
Mithqala habatim min khardalin.
It says that even if a deed, an action, a systemic input, is the weight of a mustard seed, the universe will bring it to the ledger.
It's the ultimate butterfly effect in social physics.
Yes. Think about what a mustard seed represents in a systemic context.
Okay.
It's a tiny piece of legislation that quietly marginalizes a vulnerable group. It's a subtle shift in a corporate tax code that extracts a fraction of a cent from a laborer's paycheck.
Or a minor compromise in the structural integrity of a building to save a few dollars on concrete.
Exactly.
And the elites think these mustard seeds go unnoticed because they don't result in immediate revolutions, right?
Right.
They shave off a little bit of the workers' wages, nobody riots, so they think, hey, we got away with it.
Exactly. But the algorithmic ledger of the universe misses nothing. Every single mustard seed of exploitation is placed on the scale.
Subtly compounding the systemic friction.
The structural integrity weakens by a fraction of a percent. The borders erode just a little bit more.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because when you view the text through this lens of an algorithmic, objective ledger, it completely destroys the entire religious industry of salvation.
It obliterates it.
The source points out that in traditional, corrupt religious systems, which the Quraysh essentially operated,
Right.
the elites believe they can bypass the consequences of their actions.
Yeah, the cheat codes.
Exactly. They think, I can exploit 1,000 workers, but if I perform the right ritual, or if I sacrifice enough animals at the Kaaba, or if I have the high priest chant the right prayer.
The cosmic judge will look the other way.
Right.
They view God as a corruptible king who can be bribed with a sacrifice or flattered with a chant.
A king with favorites.
They believe in clerical intercession, that a holy man can whisper in the judge's ear and get their systemic debt erased.
But you cannot bribe a physical law.
No, you can't.
You cannot perform a ritual to stop a bridge from collapsing if you built it with faulty steel.
You can chant all day, but the hydrostatic pressure on the dam doesn't care about your prayers.
Exactly. The universe does not care about your titles, your ancestry, your wealth, or how many temples you built.
Verse 47 concludes with this absolute guarantee, Fala tuzlamu nafsan shaya.
Not a single nafs.
Not a single self or system will be dealt with unjustly in the slightest.
Zero bias. Zero bribes.
Every single entity is audited strictly against objective reality without a single ounce of bias.
So no one gets a free pass.
If you put poison in the water supply, the biological law of requital will hit you, regardless of whether you are a king or a peasant.
The scales are perfectly, terrifyingly objective.
The structural ledger always balances out.
And this incredible realization brings up a massive historical sequence in the text.
Yes, verse 48.
Right, verse 48 essentially shifts the camera. We've been looking at the Quraysh in Mecca, but now the text pans way back in history to Moses and Aaron.
Great.
It says they were given Al-Furqan.
And again, the traditional mindset immediately jumps to a bearded man holding a glowing magical stone tablet on a mountaintop.
Classic Hollywood image.
If we are going to understand this as a systems audit, we have to pull this out of the realm of magic books.
Challenge accepted. So how do we strip the mythology from Al-Furqan? Because the source gives us a razor-sharp mechanical definition.
Al-Furqan literally translates to the separator or the criterion.
The separator.
But in a systemic context, it is a precise, logical metric. It is an intellectual framework that allows a leadership class to separate truth from falsehood.
In economics, it would be the metric that separates productive investments from economic parasitism.
Exactly. It is the ultimate diagnostic tool to differentiate between a system aligned with the baseline of the universe.
Rahman.
Right, Rahman, that free-flowing provision, and a system operating on terminal debt and exploitation.
It's the diagnostic tool.
It is the operational metric that tells you exactly how much your borders are eroding.
And the text doesn't just call it Al-Furqan, it also describes it as Diya, which translates to light.
But not just a soft, ambient glow.
Like a candle.
No, you have to think of it as a blinding headlight.
A spotlight.
Yes, an interrogator's spotlight. When Moses goes to Pharaoh, and we have to remember who Pharaoh was.
Right.
He was the ultimate entrenched elite of the ancient world.
The absolute peak.
He was a man who literally claimed to be the peak of the systemic pyramid, the god of his own economy.
He literally called himself a god.
Exactly. When Moses walks into that court, he doesn't just bring magic snake tricks. He brings Al-Furqan and Diya.
He brings a blinding intellectual headlight that exposes the hidden systemic dangers of Pharaoh's empire.
He runs the ultimate systems audit on an oppressive regime.
But how does he actually do that? What is the mathematics of that audit?
Think about what Pharaoh's economy was built on. Slave labor.
Right, the ultimate exploitation.
Pharaoh claimed his system provided absolute security and infinite growth. But Moses used the Furqan to look at the ledger.
Okay.
He essentially said, you are sustaining this massive architecture via slave labor. Slave labor creates an unsustainable energy deficit at the bottom of the pyramid. You are extracting maximum physical output while providing minimum biological input.
The slaves are starving while building the monuments.
Right. And mathematically, biological exhaustion will eventually outpace elite extraction.
The workers literally just die.
Plus, you have to expend massive amounts of military energy just to guard the slaves and prevent rebellion.
So it's incredibly inefficient.
It is a system built on terminal friction. Moses mathematically proved that the foundation was rotting.
Wow.
He shined the diya, the light, on the mustard seeds of oppression. He showed Pharaoh the exact microfractures in his structural foundation.
He used the logical metric to prove that the empire is not a god. It's a parasitic organism that has breached its vulnerability threshold and is about to experience collapse.
Baton.
Baton.
That is the true power of the Furqan. It demystifies the elite. It reveals that the emperor has no clothes, and more importantly, that the empire has no foundation.
Because they relied on unproven assertions.
Pharaoh thought his vast wealth, his armies, and his generational history made him immune to the law of requital.
He thought he was outside the law of physics.
The Furqan proved that his wealth was the very weight pulling his side of the scale down to destruction.
So what does this all mean? You, sitting here today, listening to an analysis of ancient Arabic texts.
Yeah, well, what's the takeaway?
It means we are subject to systemic laws, not arbitrary magic. The core realization from this section of the source material is that whether we are talking about ancient Egypt under Pharaoh, the Korash in ancient Mecca, or modern global economics on Wall Street,
Right.
the structural ledger always balances out in the end. The law of Mukafat-e-amal, that cosmic scale, is running quietly in the background of every corporation, every government, and every personal decision you make.
Absolutely. The ledger is unyielding. And to prove that this isn't just an abstract theory, the text is about to run a massive historical simulation. In Lecture 813, covering Surah 21 Ayat 5168, we are going to dive straight into the case study of Abraham. We will watch him use pure, cold, weaponized logic to physically smash the ideological models and corporate monopolies of his own father and the ruling elite.
Oh, man.
It's the ultimate rationalist showdown, and we'll break it down next time.
I cannot wait for that. It's going to be explosive. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today. We promised to strip away the mythology and show you the high-level macroeconomics hiding in plain sight. And I hope we delivered that aha moment for you.
I think we did.
But before you go, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. We started by talking about those massive skyscrapers, those structures that look so invincible from the outside.
Right.
Look around at the institutions and systems in your own life that seem completely permanent right now. It could be your company, your political system, even your own personal habits.
Yeah.
What are the unproven assertions holding them up? What are the blind spots you've developed just because things have worked out okay for a long time?
And more importantly,
Are you watching the borders?
are you watching the microfractures before the baton hits?
Exactly. Keep your eyes on the edges. We'll see you in the next deep dive.